Transgender has no coherent meaning. Although this court used the word transgender and the phrase transgender status repeatedly, uncritically, and without definition in its 2020 decision in Bostock, those words in fact do not have a coherent or stable meaning. WDI USA assumes that by transgender and transgender status in Bostock, the court meant something along the lines of not conforming to sex stereotypes, because Amy Stevens, the employee in that case who was terminated by his employer, was a man who did not conform to the stereotypes typically associated with masculinity.
The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, who is all in on
Right.
so-called transgender rights. And they represent the respondents in support of the petitioner in this matter. They define the term transgender to mean, here we go, it takes a whole paragraph. So the ACLU defines transgender to mean a broad range of identities and experiences that fall outside the traditional understanding of gender. Some of these identities and experiences include people whose gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. There's that phrase. People who transition from living as one gender to another or wish to do so, often described by the clinical term, so there's a clinical term, transsexual. People who cross-dress part of the time, and people who identify outside the traditional gender binary, meaning they identify that word. Oh my God, it's become all powerful, yeah?
Yeah, it really
Who
has.
identify outside the traditional gender binary, meaning they identify as something other than male or female.
Yeah.
Some transgender people describe themselves as gender variant or gender nonconforming. Not everyone who doesn't conform to stereotypes, however, identifies as transgender. Many people don't conform to gender stereotypes, but also continue to identify with the gender assigned to them at birth, like butch women and femme men.
Yeah.
So is it clear?
Yeah.
It's whatever I say it is.
It really is. It really is. And
Except for people who don't go with the program or who detransition or who
right.
pretend to transition, then they're very specific about what is and what isn't.
Well, there's a few activist groups who have put out an actual graphic of an umbrella, and they've put all the different kinds of identities under there: cross-dressers, transsexual, renegade genders. They're all under
Yeah.
there. So when someone says to you, "Oh, that's not a real transgender person, that's a different person," it doesn't matter, because the activist groups have made the umbrella and they're under it. Okay? It's all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Eddie Izzard, for example, when he's in girl mode, he'll use the women's bathroom. And when
Yeah.
he's in boy mode, apparently he doesn't.
And how old
And
is
we're
he?
just all supposed to be cool with that.
Why is he calling himself a girl or a boy? He's neither. He's an older fellow, older than me. Where's his age dysphoria? Why doesn't he have age dysphoria?
I think he does.
Maybe that's why he's
I
calling
mean,
himself a
it's
boy or
something
a
weird
girl.
if you're in your 60s and you're talking about girl mode. Let me go back a bit, 'cause it's fantastic. It's what we're dealing with. Expert people. The ACLU is a whole bunch of lawyers.
Yeah.
So it would defy reason to establish a quasi-suspect class of such people for equal protection purposes based on this definition or lack thereof. I think they're trying to hide the fact they don't have a definition.
Yeah. Right.
And this court ought not want to be the court that establishes such a classification for a group of people that, at least according to the ACLU, includes part-time cross-dressers.
Right. No kidding.
Now we get to the next pillars of logic and integrity, the Human Rights Campaign.
The big soft power peddling international organization. In a similar vein, HRC defines the word transgender to mean an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and/or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. It uses the term non-binary to mean an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside these categories. While many also identify as transgender, not all non-binary people do. Go figure. Non-binary can also be used as an umbrella term encompassing identities such as agender, bigender, genderqueer, or gender fluid. So, according to the HRC, transgender is an umbrella term encompassing people who have a gender identity and/or expression that differs from cultural expectations. Notably, all human beings, to varying degrees, defy conformity with sex stereotypes. Also, according to the HRC, a transgender person can also be non binary or not. Said person might also be agender, bigender, genderqueer, or gender fluid or not. No one can say coherently what any of this actually means. True enough.
People think, oh, human rights campaign. You should
Good.
trust them, or at least approach it with skepticism. But what this gender identity stuff has shown is that you just really can't. And this has got so far because there was like a media blackout.
Right.
There was no interrogation or deliberation about this stuff.
And I think it's a shame that these big organizations like Human Rights Campaign or UN, whatever, you get a few weirdos coming up with this stuff and it infects the whole thing. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because of these campaigners.
But at the same time, apparently there's no gatekeepers in any of these institutions. If they
Well,
went along with it, they go along with it.
right? Like it's some kind of amazing entryism that they could give lessons to.
When did this happen? That if you identify as, no one can say anything about it and you have to be accommodated. Well, apparently only when it comes to quote unquote gender. And it's so ridiculous because when it matters is when it infringes upon sex, which is real. So I want to go into that space. Well,
Right.
no, but you're male. No, I have a gender identity. It's
Right.
crazy that you
I
can
have this
identify out of being male or female is ridiculous.
Right.
This is ridiculous. But yet here we are. Perhaps the best we can do, given the above definitions from the two most prominent quote unquote transgender advocates in the US, is to try to characterize any common ground. Claims to be quote unquote transgender seem to involve a set of beliefs about an identity its adherents call gender, which appears to affect how they present themselves outwardly to others, as well as to what they believe about themselves and the people around them. People who claim to have a gender identity point to an ever growing collection of subtypes that's it, as evidence by the healthy lists of options from both the ACLU and HRC. This is interesting. So they multiply it instead of dealing with what's the specific thing. It's almost by multiplying and adding to it somehow makes something here. How could you divide something up in so many bits if there wasn't something there? All to hide the fact that at the core, it's nothing tangible.
It's just
Magic.
magic puff of dandelion.
Identify as rich, identify as skinny, identify as
Right?
Tanya, identify as Russian, identify as Chinese, identify as American.
There used to be some joke about people identifying as an attack helicopter, and then they all got booted off of Twitter for being
Don't
funny.
you dare poke a hole in my fantasy and my power trip. Okay. Depending on the advocate's claims, these newly discovered identities may be said to exist for a small percentage of population on one hand, or all of us on the other. And they have definitely been experienced in all cultures and through all of human history, or they have some other equally implausible attribute.
Yeah, ridiculous. Have you seen people who try to suggest that sex is some kind of construct of Western cultures that came about in the Middle Ages or something?
Oh, yeah, it's colonialism. It's the Western heteronormative, white supremacist, patriarchal notion that humans come in two varieties, male and female.
Yeah.
If that's what you identify as history, then or biology, evolution,
ridiculous.
anthropology, fine.
It totally erases even Joan of Arc, right? They totally negate the fact that she was such an anomaly. They negate all of the things that these women overcame to do what they did. As the court below noted, instead of defining a discrete group, transgender can describe a huge variety of gender identities and expressions The bottom line is that transgender and transgender status do not denote a sufficiently coherent category of people to warrant the recognition of a quasi-suspect class for equal protection purposes, and this court should affirm the decision of the court below.
So that's the first part of the argument, and it seems pretty airtight to me. That how can you base a law on this? It basically take our word for it. Gender identity exists, it's important, and you just need to accommodate.
Yep.
And if that means suppressing kids' puberty and rearranging their genitals and sterilization and all this other stuff, well, so be it, because nothing is more important than this thing, but don't ask us to pin down exactly what it is.
That's right.
They're just anti-trans. They're just mean. They hate trans kids. And of course, the ACLU is noble, and they're trying to protect quote unquote trans kids, which is as real as a vegan cat. Anyway,